Hello, everybody, and welcome back to World Talks, where every word matters here on TVP World. My name's Don Arleth. Now, since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, many have been wondering whether Belarus will attack Ukraine and become directly involved in the conflict. However, we must remember Belarus allowed the training and stationing of Russian troops and even allowed Russia to attack Ukraine from its own territory. But the Belarusian army did not directly enter into the war in Ukraine, at least thus far. And now joining me here to discuss this issue is Andrew Dianeri, Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Hello, and thank you very much for joining me on World Talks tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Now, why don't we just not beat around the bush? In your opinion, do you think it is possible that Alexander Lukashenko would ever make the fatal mistake and actually involve his armed forces in the conflict in Ukraine?
Unfortunately, I do think it's absolutely possible. I mean, there were lots of folks, if we think back to February 2022, that didn't think that Vladimir Putin would send Russian troops into Ukraine because it didn't make much rational sense for him to do such a thing, that the Russian forces would be beaten back, or that the response from the West would be so strong that it would actually not be in Putin's interest to do such a thing. Of course, unfortunately, we saw that did play out, and we've had really a grinding war for the last 2.5 years in Ukraine due to Russian aggression. So I think it's correct to say, as you mentioned there, that Belarusian troops entering Ukraine would be kind of catastrophic both for Belarus, and it would be a major problem for Ukraine. But I don't think we can exclude that, because not all these leaders act on rational strategy, as it were.
Yes. Okay. So in the event that this does become a big threat for Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine has been preparing for this for a long time. If you look at the northern border regions with Belarus, it is very well fortified, defended, and staffed by Ukrainian armed forces. Some would say that those forces are tied up over there where it's likely that not much will happen, and so it drains the manpower that is needed in the east. So if Belarus was to do this, they would face most likely quite a hefty foe, would they not?
Absolutely. You're exactly right that the Ukrainians, I think, after the first Russian attempted blitz on Kyiv, and after the Russians were driven out from the north, realized that they did need to reinforce their northern borders, even though much of the fight continued in the south and in the east. So in the ensuing kind of 2+ years, the Ukrainians, as you say, have built up heavy fortifications in the north, and they've stationed thousands of troops there. And so, were Belarusian forces to try to cross that border, and I think there's probably in the tens of thousands there, if reports are to be believed. Those forces, high-end forces, we should note on the Belarusian side, would meet stiff resistance, both in terms of Ukrainian fortifications, mines, and also manpower.
Now, from what we can tell, self-proclaimed President Alexander Lukashenko has been trying to keep his forces out of direct conflicts with Ukraine. But how much does Vladimir Putin have to say when it comes to this? And based on what we're seeing in Kursk, in the Kursk region of Russia, is it possible that Vladimir Putin could be putting pressure on Alexander Lukashenko to come to his rescue to some degree?
Absolutely. I mean, Putin has been pretty transparent about his desire to make Belarus a vassal state of Russia. And Lukashenko has at times tried to hold him off at arm's length, but I think we can pretty safely say that Belarus is pretty significantly controlled by folks in Moscow, and that Lukashenko, as you say, the self-proclaimed president, owes his position in large part to Putin. So, if Putin did want or did ask Lukashenko to deploy troops from Belarus to Ukraine, that I think it'd be difficult for him to say no. And we should also note that Lukashenko doesn't really have an interest in deploying these troops, and it would only be in Putin's interest to basically distract Ukraine from the east, from Kursk, and from the south, where Russian forces continue to kind of poke and prod and try to take more Ukrainian territory, that this would be kind of a distraction that would be something that Putin might want to do.
What do you think that would do domestically to Alexander Lukashenko at home? I know many Belarusians are definitely against the war in Ukraine. Could this be one of the final nails in his coffin if he does make such a decision?
Well, one of the reasons why Lukashenko has tried to maintain at least some amount of autonomy from Putin is because the Belarusian people don't want, by and large, to be under the thumb of Moscow. They like their sovereignty. They want freedom, even though the Belarusian regime has been incredibly repressive. But I think we saw back in 2020 just how strong the Belarusian desire is for their own self-determination. And were Lukashenko to, acting on the orders of Putin, invade Ukraine and make Belarus a direct combatant in this war, I think the response from the Belarusian people, even despite many years of repression from the Belarusian authorities, would be pretty swift and would be a direct threat on Lukashenko himself's rule.
When we look back at the situation when Russia launched its forces from Belarusian territory, some of the first big acts of sabotage that we saw actually was taking place in Belarus by Belarusians. Mm-hmm. So is that something that could also enter the calculation here should Alexander Lukashenko decide to use his forces?
That's absolutely something we could see again, particularly if domestic opinion in Belarus starts to turn once again against Lukashenko and the people start to really come out in force and protest. I remember back in 2021 and 2022, this BIPOL, this essentially secret kind of consortium of Belarusian police officers that worked against the Lukashenko regime. And we saw saboteurs trying to essentially stop Russian hardware, military hardware, from accessing specific points in Belarus that would, again, from there, go to Ukraine. So I do think if Lukashenko were to make this decision, if Putin were to continue to put pressure on him to make these so far exercises or what look like pretty major provocations real, we would, I do think, see more sabotage were that to be the case.
If we look at the size of Belarus, it's much smaller than Ukraine. I think if we, based on all the people that have fled since these sham elections in 2020, they'd be lucky to count 10 million amongst their population at best. But I'm also curious as to how much military might they've retained, in that Russia has probably, I don't know if this is a thing or not a thing, but has some of the equipment, has some of the ammunition, has some of the things that Belarus would need to make any kind of attack successful. Is it there in Belarus? Has it already been transferred to Russia? What are their capabilities?
So the Belarusian army is significant, we should say, especially for a country of 9 million people. Lukashenko a couple weeks ago said he was trying to transfer a third of their active duty soldiers closer to Ukraine. Were that to be the case, we'd see 10, maybe 15,000 Belarusian troops is what we should expect to see in things like that, augmented, of course, by these ex-Wagner forces who are highly trained and highly skilled operators who, of course, fought in Ukraine for months or for years, many of them. And so Belarusian capabilities, while not on they don't have quite a sharp tip of a spear that maybe a Ukraine or a Russia or a more modern army elsewhere in Europe would have, they do have some significant capabilities and enough manpower and enough well-trained manpower to be a problem for Ukraine.
Now, concerning the Wagner group, members of the Wagner group that are still there, we've seen them deployed close to the Polish border, in the southwest of the country. We've also seen them in the northwest of the country. Have the Wagner group, have they been sitting there in Belarus the whole entire time? Are they involved in active operations in Ukraine or elsewhere? What is their situation?
Well, Wagner's, I think, so interesting to so many of us in the West because it operates as this kind of shadowy paramilitary force that the Kremlin sends to do its dirty work, not only in Ukraine or Belarus, but elsewhere in the world. Of course, Wagner operated in Syria for many years and has worked in sub-Saharan Africa as well. And we've seen over the past several months reports of militias in Africa kicking out Wagner troops and Wagner forces and Wagner trained forces across kind of the Sahel region there in Africa. So Wagner, of course, has been in Belarus kind of since the Prigozhin mutiny, but it's such a almost shape-shifting kind of force that they can have small bands in a number of conflicts around the world, and of course seek to exacerbate those.
And finally, if you're Ukrainian commander, if you're General Syrski, what do you do with your forces on the northern border there along Belarus? How do you prepare, and what exactly posture should they have at this moment?
Well, I think Ukraine did the right thing in issuing the really kind of deterrent statement we saw just yesterday, threatening that if Belarus were to send troops across the border, send rockets across the border from Belarus proper, that they would become a real combatant in the war, and that Ukraine would strike back, as if that were to be the case. And so I think we could see long-range rockets going into Belarus, targeting places of military personnel and military materiel in Belarus, excuse me. And then if Belarusian soldiers tried to cross the border, I think General Syrski probably trusts the embankments, the defenses that Ukrainian forces have built up there. And as you said earlier, kind of in our conversation, Ukraine does have a number of troops already stationed there. So I would think that Ukraine would rely on what it's already built there. It's expected this. It's hoping to deter an attack from Belarus. But if one does come, they'll certainly be ready, at least in the initial phases.
Well, let's certainly hope that this situation doesn't develop further. Andrew Dianeri, Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, thank you very much for joining me tonight on World Talks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.